All right, so welcome back to Chapter 2. We left off talking about the culture of ancient Sumer. And remember, Sumer, or the Sumerians, were really the sort of foundational culture of Mesopotamia in the Bronze Age. Ultimately, the Sumerians could not hold on to power. And the Sumerians were invaded by a people called the Akkadians from a place called Akkad. You guessed it. So in 2332, the Sumerians came under domination from the Akkadians. The Akkadians are really kind of like one of the first empires. One strong ruler, emperor, king, whatever it is, who controls a large area with usually through conquest, and kind of imposes his will or the will of the society on those they conquer. One of the major Akkadian kings is a king named Sargon. This is the guy who invaded Sumer. We are looking here at a copper sculpture that was made with a form of casting. Casting is a technique where you pour metal into a mold. So this is a casting process. This is in many ways kind of an early version of the kinds of images that we will associate with power and with monarchy. We see a special kind of headdress or a crown denoting that this is a person that wields power, with the crown as a symbol of their power as the head, literally the head of state. We also see a beard, which in the ancient Mesopotamian world was often associated with wisdom and intelligence. You'll notice that his eyes, though, are missing, and that is because they've been gouged out. A much later people, thousands of years later, the Medes people, when they conquered this area, they destroyed the statues of previous rulers. Why would you do that? Well, it's a way of asserting your own power. Oftentimes, whenever one culture invades or attacks or usurps or whatever, another culture, you'll often see the destruction of those images, the old images of power, as a way of saying, hey, the new guys are in town and look at the power we have over the previous rulers. And to give a more modern example of this is from April 2003, when United States forces occupied the city of Baghdad in Iraq, and when it was still under control of Saddam Hussein, when the United States came over and invaded Iraq, destroyed one of the principal images of the ruler in one of the most visited and sort of recognized places in the capital city. This is, of course, a symbolic gesture, but its symbolism can hold a lot of weight. And so this is the power of images right here. This is why we're studying images. This is why they're important, because people equate images often with the thing they represent. So the idea is, if you can destroy the image of Saddam Hussein, in this case, then we have conquered Saddam Hussein himself. Destroy the image, control the power. Let's look at another Akkadian work of art. This is the Victory Stele of Naram Sin. Stele, what is that word? A stele is simply a stone, usually that is decorated or has writing on it. Naram Sin is the great-grandson of Sargon. This is to commemorate a victory over a group of people called the Lullaby. This was stolen many centuries later. In fact, part of the writing here is not original, but it was stolen by a culture called the Elamites from Elam. You might recognize the name from the Bible. But when they stole this, they basically wrote their own graffiti on it, basically saying, look how powerful we are. We took this magnificent stele from this ancient and powerful king. We now control it. So, you control the image, you control the power, right? First of all, you'll notice that this is a little different than some of the other images that we have seen from ancient Mesopotamia. Most ancient Mesopotamian images are divided into strict registers, those horizontal bands that allow us to see and read the image more clearly. We're not seeing that here. And instead, we're actually seeing this rather kind of jumble of figures as they ascend up the mountain. A mountain. And if you look above at the top, you see Naram Sin himself. You can tell he's the most powerful guy. Why? Because he's the largest guy, right? Hieratic or hierarchical scale. The most important figure is the biggest figure. And he's also wearing some bull horns. Oh my goodness. It's like a greatest hits of early art already. Most powerful dude's the biggest dude, and to show that he's really, really powerful, we'll put some bull horns on his head. He's also holding his spear as a symbol of his power. At the top, we can see next to the image of Naram Sin is an image of two figures. One of them has a spear in his neck that he is struggling to pull out, and the other one is begging for mercy, looking up at these god figures, asking for mercy, which he will not receive. This, of course, is demonstrating Naram Sin's divine power. If you look up here at the top of the mountain, and if we zoom out, you can see it in context. If you look at the top of the mountain, you can see there are 3 stars. This could represent several different concepts. These could represent sort of 3 individual gods. These could represent sort of a concept of fate, like it was literally in the stars, right, that Naram Sin would conquer the Lullaby people. But the idea is that this is a divine victory, that these 3 stars represent that this was a victory that was fated and approved of by the gods. You will often see a leader being blessed or being given the thumbs up or whatever it is by a god or group of gods. Why? Well, it's one thing to say, you know, I conquered these people for the good of the country or for my own personal gain or simply because I want to show what a badass I am or whatever reason it is. But it's a whole other reason to say I conquered these people because it was divinely ordained by the gods or God to rule and to conquer these other people. Okay, so the NeoSumerians. So Sumer comes back. So basically the Akkadians start to lose power and we start to see the Sumerians sort of reestablish control. And they kind of come back bigger and badder than ever. And in the city of they build a ziggurat. This thing is, about 5 times larger than some of the other ancient Sumerian ziggurats. So this is quite large. And here, despite its tremendous size, it's the same basic shape. It's a trapezoid. It serves the same basic function as the earlier Sumerian ziggurats did, in that it is literally a sort of waiting room for the gods. And you can see the temple at the top. This was made with a combination of mud brick with a lot of the flat areas made with a material called bitumen. Bitumen, B-I-T-U-M-E-N, which is an element that is a primary part of asphalt. This is an artificial mountain. This is a holy mountain. High places are holy places. We don't have a mountain nearby, so we built one so we can get closer to the gods. The key leader of this Neo-Sumerian movement is a guy named Gudea. Gudea was a priest king, and you can see in his depiction he wears sort of a combination of, he wears this sort of kingly sort of crown, but he wears the robes of a priest. There are quite a few statues of Gudea available. There are somewhere around 24 that have been discovered. Most of them there are meant to sort of emphasize his not only kind of kingliness and his priestliness, but also to emphasize this idea that he is a servant of the gods. So he is often shown with his hands clasped in prayer to show where his mind is. You can also see that he's rather sort of built. He has these strong arms and these strong chest, which are meant to show that he is capable to carry out the will and the work of the gods. these statues would have been made for various temples. They were made out of a material called diorite. Diorite is a very, very hard black stone. It is very difficult to carve because it is so hard. But this is one of the reasons why it was so desirable, because it would protect or help protect the statue from breaking. Now, as you can see by the statue in the middle, this didn't always work out because if somebody really wants to destroy something, they could, but it did help to protect it because these are sacred objects, these are objects of import, and so these strong, rare materials are sort of appropriate for protection, but also to show the importance. You'll notice that their text covers his robes. This text in this particular sculpture describes how this temple was built. So it's meant to sort of represent these sort of great works and the struggles and the sort of incredible abilities and planning that Gudea was able to accomplish to construct a large temple. This image is rather interesting. First of all, it's not made of diorite. It's made of a softer stone called calcite. But besides that, in many ways, it's very similar to all the other images of Gudea we have seen. And you'll see that he holds in his hand a vase or a jar. And spewing out of the jar is liquid, almost like it's just forcing its own way out. Water, of course, is a symbol of life. It is also often used as an offering to the gods. But really what this is meant to represent is Gudea's ability to provide for his people and the sort of bounty that he is able to provide. He is... Though there's so much water in this jar that it can't be contained. It is overflowing. It is abundant. It is almost divine in its abundance and in the way it behaves, just in the way that Gudea himself is a servant of the gods and then thus sort of blessed with the divine. So the NeoSumerians eventually fall. And so we start to see the Babylonians will rise. This is called the Stele of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the great king of the Babylonians. This was stolen along with the Stele of Naram Sin by the Elamites much, much later. This has something along the lines of 3,500 lines of text, and it contains almost 300 different laws. So this is our first example of a completely intact list of laws. You'll notice that we see up at the top, we see the king Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god Shamash. So let's sort of break it down here. So first of all, you'll notice that we see the stele, which is well, basically kind of a mountain, isn't it? It's this sort of elongated mountain, possibly phallic in reference, possibly reference in male power, and then also the idea that sort of divine knowledge comes from above, and you have to sort of ascend to come in contact with that divine knowledge. So in this case, Hammurabi is now at the top of the mountain where he is receiving this sort of divine information from the god Shamash. Shamash is sitting enthroned. You'll notice that Shamash's crown is made up of a series of stacked horns, of stacked bull horns. You'll also notice that he is holding basically a rod and a circle. These are surveying tools. These are tools by which one rules or measures, right? So notice the double meaning here of the word to rule. To rule means to measure or to control or to kind of define, right? And it also means to rule, to impose one's will or the will of the gods or the will of the state or whatever it is over a group of people. And notice that, and the law itself comes from the god. It doesn't come from Hammurabi. Because if, once again, sort of like with Naram Sin, it's one thing to say, all right, I'm going to conquer all you people because, oh, I'm bored and I feel like conquering. It's another thing to say, I'm going to conquer all you people because it's the God's will. It's the same thing with laws. It's one thing to say, all right, we're going to have these laws because, well, they just make things run more smoothly. It's another thing to say, these laws are the will of the gods, and if you disobey them, you're disobeying the will of the god. You can see that he is holding his hand up. No, he's not about to lay the smack down, but this is a symbol of oration. This is a symbol of talking, which is very, very common in the ancient world to see people do this. It means, hey, I'm talking. And then below this, we see the laws and the rules themselves. Probably the most famous law that comes from this is the law of an eye for an eye. If someone damages your eye, then the law decrees it that their eye must be damaged. If somebody breaks your arm, then their arm must be broken. But the laws on this stele are, they focus on business transactions. There's actually laws about reproduction and governing, parentage and having babies and all that good stuff, and there's also economic kinds of laws here. So it kind of covers all the different sort of aspects of a society. This thing is impressive. This is located in the Louvre, and I've seen this in person, and it's 7 feet tall. It is, taller than, most people. It is, unless you're a basketball player, it is quite tall and quite imposing, but it is literally the law of the land is given from the gods to the ruler Hammurabi. Moving on, let's take a look at the Assyrians around the first millennium BCE. They were known for being merciless warriors and ruling sort of with an iron fist and even sort of committing sort of extreme acts of cruelty. This was a very sort of warlike power whose cities were often designed and palaces were often designed more like fortresses than sort of traditional residences or cities. And this can be seen here in this reconstruction of the citadel of Sargon II at Dur-Shurukin, where you are looking at the palace of the king, but it is designed in a way really that it is a fortified city. It's a citadel. It is meant to provide military protection for the king. Assyrian art then is very sort of militaristic in its depictions. It is very focused on the concept of power and might. It is often built, of course, on a very large scale. You are looking at these guardian figures called lamassus that were placed at the points of entrance into Dur-Shurukin. You can see, the gates here are rather sort of large, and there's very few of them. This is, of course, meant to control the influx of people and to provide protection. And so it's sort of fitting that in this, basically a fortress, in the citadel, what we are seeing is these large, powerful creatures called lamassu guarding and protecting the king and his fortress. The lamassus contained the face of the king. They were sort of a hybrid animal. Horns of a bull and the body of a bull and the wings of an eagle. So you have two very powerful creatures here, sort of mixed in with a human face with the double bull horns. Okay, so these are all sort of visual strategies that we have seen before. To give you guys a sense of context, though, these are rather quite large. They are almost 14 feet tall. So they are symbols of protection, right? They are literally guarding the entrance to this citadel. You'll notice that there is something rather interesting about the number of legs that the Lamassu have. They have 5 legs, but this is not the depiction of a 5-legged animal. This is a 4-legged animal. But what we are seeing is conceptual and perceptual images. This is a sort of textbook conceptual image, because this is an image that is meant to be seen from 2 angles. First of all, when you approach the gate, you see it from the front, and it has 2 legs, right? But when you walk past it, and you see it from the side, going to our image here, you'll see that it has 4 legs. So it is simply meant to sort of represent what an animal actually looks like and how we think of this animal. Because if it had only 3 legs visible from the side, that would imply that the animal was missing a leg and it wasn't as powerful as it should be, and that then subsequently the king maybe isn't as powerful as he should be. But the Assyrian king was quite proud of these. In fact, the friezes along the wall of relief sculpture, of bas-relief sculpture, display images of the construction of the Lamassu. So the Assyrians were sort of so proud of these that they actually showed you how how they were being built and how they were shipped and how they were constructed. So this comes from a king, Arshonarsirapal. If we zoom in on the image here and you look at the profile of the king, you can see that he's actually rendered in a way that's fairly realistic here. His entire body is sort of seen in portrait, in profile, I should say. But if you look at his eye, you'll notice that his eye is like a forward-looking eye, but it's placed on the side of his head, as if he's almost as like a fish eye or a fish head. This is something called the composite figure or the composite view, meaning that his head is shown from 2 different angles. His head is in profile, but his eye, which should be looking straight ahead like this, is looking out at you from the side. It is shown in a frontwards view. What is going on here? Well, this, of course, is another example of a conceptual image. But you see this a lot in early art. And the idea is that the artist is trying to show you the body parts from their most recognizable view. So oftentimes, human heads are shown in profile because that's the easiest way to sort of display them. And yet, eyes, when you think of an eye, you think of an eye generally looking straight at you. And so oftentimes in ancient art, what we'll see is this composite view, where different body parts seen from different angles are composited, kind of stitched together to give us this conceptual view of the human body. So eyes are often shown on the side of the head, kind of looking straight out at us. I mentioned earlier bas-relief sculpture. Here's a really great example from it, from the palace of Arshonarsirapal. This is an image of war. Here we see Assyrian archers on the banks shooting at their enemy. Notice the composite figure, especially with the eye here. The Assyrians loved hunting. In fact, they would often stage hunts within the walls of the palace themselves in large courtyards. But here we see the king in his chariot on a lion hunt. And what I want you to really pay attention to is the difference through which the people and the animals are portrayed. And if you look really closely, you'll notice that it's rather quite different. If you look at the figures in the chariot, you'll notice that they're relatively unrealistic looking. We have this weird sort of composite view. We have noticed the chest of the king is facing us, and yet he's turning to the side like this, in a way that you would never really stand if you were using a bow and arrow. You'd be more like this, right? But his chest is straight up because they want to show us every major part of the body from its most recognizable angle. And then, of course, his eyeball is placed on the side of his head. But if you look at the animals And I'm going to zoom in here on a lion. Look at the level of realism. It's much more realistic, not only because of a lack of a composite view, but sort of the interest in the musculature underneath the lion's skin. Attention has been paid to trying to create a fairly realistic mane. But also I think where the realism really comes in is in the face of the lion. This is a lion that has been slain. It has been wounded. It has been, well, he's not wounded, he's killed. And so we see this rather sort of gruesome image, if you think about it. The animal has sort of slammed its face against the ground, and its jaw is being pushed back into its face, and its lips are being distorted by the pressure of its head against the ground. That is an extreme level of realism that we don't see when we see human beings being depicted. Let's take another look. And I gotta be honest with you guys, this to me is one of the most moving images ever made, and I'm gonna see if I can explain myself here. So we see a lioness, and as you know, lionesses are the hunters of the lion world. They do the majority of the hunting. They are fierce and protective creatures, lionesses are. And we see this incredible artist rendering of this lioness who has been wounded with arrows. And we can even see one arrow has fully pierced her abdomen and probably pierced her spine. And if you look closely, you'll notice that her legs are being dragged limply behind her as she pulls her body along the ground because she is now paralyzed. And if we look at her face, you can see the anger and the rage against her oncoming death in her face. This isn't just a reaction to a pain. This is a real emotion that we are witnessing here. And if you look closely at her muzzle, you can see the wrinkles in her nose. You can see the wrinkles of her skin behind her cheeks. And you can see her ears pinned back. The artist has really observed this lion's in pain, and the different facial expressions and the different features that a lion will make, and they have rendered that as realistically or naturalistically as possible. The effect is impressive. The effect is, I think, incredibly moving and emotional. And if we contrast that with any image of any human being we have seen up until this point, I think you realize that the realism here is unlike anything we have ever seen in a human being, at least in ancient cultures. Why? That's a really good question. And the reason has to do probably with the fact that, first of all, the images of human beings that we're mostly looking at are kings, or priests, or people who are above and better than most other people. And so they are depicted in a way that makes them seem more like symbols of people and less like real people. Because the king is ultimately somebody you will never know personally. And the king isn't really a real person. They are a divinely chosen, ruler picked by the gods. They are divine, so are priests. And so their representation is often more symbolic. Whereas in the ancient world, oftentimes when we see images of animals, they tend to be a lot more lifelike or naturalistic. Neo-Babylon. The Babylonians come back, and this sort of second phase of Babylonian history is sort of Babylon at its height. And of course, you're probably, when I talk about Babylon, probably most of you comes from the Bible, and comes from the book of Daniel, and comes from the story of the king Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel would interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. You're probably somewhat familiar with that. But Babylon was one of the great cities of the ancient world. In fact, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, came from Babylon. But we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the Ishtar Gates. Now, the Babylonians like all of the Mesopotamian people, worshiped multiple gods. And the city of Babylon was divided into basically 8 different districts, and each district represented or was dedicated to one of those gods. The most sacred of those districts was for the goddess Ishtar, and this is her gates. This was built by Nebuchadnezzar. But if you look at it, we see an image of brick that has been glazed blue. This was meant to signify its importance, because this kind of glazing would have been very difficult, very expensive to do. So this is meant to not only represent the power and wealth of the king and the power and wealth of Babylon itself, but also the power of the goddess Ishtar. The building, the gate itself is covered with images of bulls. It's covered with images of dragons and other powerful creatures. On New Year's, these gates were opened, and there was a special sort of procession, a parade that would go down these through the gates. But the entire street, really, leading up to the gate, is covered with these kinds of images of power and wealth. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our lecture with the Persian Empire, or to be more technically accurate, the Achaemenid dynasty. But the Achaemenids controlled the largest empire, one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And if you look at our map here, you can see what I mean. This is a Persian empire, so today think modern-day Iran, where they would be based. But this is a culture that spread to, on the eastern side, the Indus River in India, and taking up today modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. If we look over here, we see it basically covers all of Mesopotamia, Turkey, and into southern Europe and Egypt. So at its height, this was the most powerful and largest empire in the world. But because of this, it encompassed many different cultures and many different styles of art within its art and architecture. This is very much a multicultural society. Most of the societies that we have been looking at so far have been more or less monocultures. That's not entirely true, but what do I mean by monoculture? By monoculture, I mean a culture that is basically one kind of people, one ethnicity, one religion, one sort of overall kind of political viewpoint, monocultures. The Persians were a multicultural empire, encompassing many different religious viewpoints, many different cultural traditions, and many artistic traditions. And we will see that play out in Persian art. Now, I do want you to keep in mind, though, that since a lot of the Persian territory was Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian influenced cultures, we're going to see a Mesopotamian influence. On the left is called the Gate of All Nations. This leads into the Persian capital of Persepolis. And you can see that the entrance is guarded by two basically bull-like creatures with human heads containing double horns. Does that look familiar? It should look just like the Assyrian Lamassu, because that's where the Persians got the idea. So here's an aerial view of Persepolis. This is the remnants of various buildings, and in the background is what is called the Apadana, Apadana. Here's the spelling right here, which is basically the audience hall of the king. Now, this thing is more or less in ruins today because it was burnt down in the 4th century by Alexander the Great, probably in retaliation for the Persians' attack on Greece. It would have been, of course, a massive hall containing a bunch of columns holding up a timber roof. We call this kind of building a hypostyle hall, Hypostyle. What does hypostyle mean? It simply really means a lot of columns. But basically think of like a forest of columns. Think of dozens, if not hundreds, of massive columns that would have supported this huge roof. And you're looking at, a structure that is, upwards near 100 feet tall or so. So you're looking at an incredibly large structure, and each column with a capital at the top would have been supporting a massive timber roof. Here is a close-up of a reconstruction. So as you can see, to show off the wealth of the Persian rulers, these buildings would have been very colorfully painted, and they would have been decorated with materials like precious metals and jewels and things like that, as well as tapestries and fabrics and those other kinds of things. Here is an example on the left of one of these capitals to scale, and that is me, actually. This was taken a number of years ago now, but this was at the Louvre in Paris, where they have several of these columns. And the columns are basically have a double capital at the top where these large timbers, and you can see the timbers themselves are actually constructed from a series of smaller timbers. And these are about like 1 foot square or so timbers that have been stacked on top of each other. So they're absolutely huge. And they nestle into this sort of U-joint of the capital. Now, the kinds of images you see on these capitals are typically images of powerful creatures, eagles, bulls, the kinds of stuff we would have seen in Mesopotamia. Now, keep in mind, the Achaemenid dynasty, the Persian dynasty, is not Mesopotamian. It is Persian. This is a culturally and ethnically different people, and yet they've adopted these symbols of power from Mesopotamia to use as their own kinds of symbols of power. And so we can see that here. But what I really want to talk about is the relief sculpture. I'm going to go back here an image or two. And the Apadana, at the center of the Apadana is a staircase leading to sort of this front porch area. And you'll notice that there is painted relief sculpture at the base. And in fact, the entire complex would have been filled with painted relief sculpture. And the images here are a little different than the kinds of images that we would have seen in other in Mesopotamian cultures. The images here refer to the diversity of the people of the Persian Empire. And they also refer to the kindness and the sort of giving nature. The word is largesse, Largesse. That just means the givingness, right? The largesse of the king. And so what we actually see are images of people from all over the ancient Persian world. We see people in different costumes, carrying different kinds of goods, sort of symbolizing the sort of diversity and multiculturalness of the ancient Persian Empire. As we've seen these kinds of images before of bounty, of a ruler sort of placed in the middle or an important area of a picture, and then people bringing them stuff as a symbol of the bounty that the ruler is able to provide, and we certainly see that here. But this is also meant to sort of represent the kind of unity of diversity of the ancient Persian Empire and how many different cultures could come together to contribute to the glory of the empire. So we're not just seeing here the glorification of the king, but we're in many ways seeing the glorification of the empire itself and its strength in the diversity of the people of that empire, which is very different than some of the other images of power that we've seen in other Mesopotamian cultures, which tend to show more of a kind of monoculture and tend to show the power of one supreme ruler. Now, we certainly see that here. We see this image of the ruler. And if you look at this image, I'm going to go back really quickly. This is it here in a reconstruction. It would have been painted down here at the bottom. But let's take a look at it. So it's missing its paint now. But we see the ruler, the king of the Achaemenid people, a ruler named Darius, or Darius, however you want to pronounce it. And Darius is sitting enthroned. And you can tell he's the king not only because he's wearing a crown, and not only because he has a long beard, and because he's sitting in a throne, all sort of symbols that we've seen before, but because of our good old buddy Hieratic Scale. He's the biggest dude in the picture. And behind him is the second biggest dude. It's his son Xerxes, Xerxes. But you'll see on the right-hand side, approaching the king is an ambassador or consulate, somebody of importance. And you can tell that he is addressing the king. How? Because he's doing speech. His hand is next to his mouth. He is addressing the king. We have similar sorts of images with the Achaemenids. We have images of bulls and eagles and powerful animals. We have use of rare and precious materials to denote power and wealth. But instead of seeing sort of this idea of absolute rule and absolute power, we see a power that comes from the largeness and the integration of many peoples within one empire who spoke different languages and practiced different religions, being united under a common good. Aha. So, pictures used and borrowed from other cultures, used in a new way. So that wraps up this chapter, and I will see you next time. Bye.